Good afternoon. I'm Stafford Hood, founding director of CREA, and it is my personal privilege and honor to join in this year-long centennial celebration of our elder Professor Edmund W Gordon on this occasion of CREA's 5th Gordon Distinguished Senior Lecture. Some of you already know, and others it should not be a surprise, that Elder Gordon informed and stirred my early thinking about culturally responsive assessment that later prompted me to extend this line of inquiry to what I called culturally responsive evaluation. He has nurtured my thinking and writing in this regard with a significant footprint in January 2000 when he was the keynote speaker at the first National Annual Conference on the Relevance of Assessment and Cultural Evaluation that I co-founded at Arizona State University. So just to provide a quick reflection, here are a few slides of the previous Gordon lecturers and a couple of special moments at CREA as well. The first should not be a surprise that Professor Gordon was our first distinguished senior lecturer. The second was followed in 2016 by another elder, Lloyd Bond, who served as the distinguished lecturer that year. The third lecture was by Guillermo Solano Flores of Stanford. Guillermo had been part of our discussions when I was at Arizona State University. Our fourth distinguished lecturer, Dr. Margaret Bill Spencer from the University of Chicago. What has always been appropriate has been the opening and the closing ceremonies have always been providing the context for the CREA conference and the Gordon lecture. And so we always appropriately begin and end with the voices of our indigenous community. These are just a couple of special moments with Elder Gordon at the CREA conference. Professor Gordon continues to challenge, inform, and inspire my thinking, as well as countless others. I am still in awe of what he has done and what he continues to do at the age of 100. We now turn to the welcomes of Professor Gordon, followed by Dean James D. Anderson's introduction of CREA's 5th Edmund W. Gordon Distinguished Senior Lecture. Thank you.
Dean Anderson, Dr. Hood, Dr. Nasir. Good afternoon, gentle people. My name is Edmund Gordon. What a privilege it is for me to welcome you to the annual meeting of the Center for Culturally Responsive Evaluation and Assessment. How rare a privilege it is to welcome participants in an annual lecture that is named for oneself by a major professional association. What an additional privilege it is for me to have lived long enough, 100 years, believe it or not, long enough to hear several of the guest speakers deliver these lectures. But even more rare is the privilege to hear a lecture being delivered by the president of the Spencer Foundation, who is also the president of the American Educational Research Association, and who, in addition, is a personal friend and a colleague in the struggle for social justice. My friends, my cup runneth over. This time I'm being honored because of an interest in culture, not just culture, but cultural relevance, the relevance of culture for our enterprise. How very appropriate it is for Stafford Hood throughout CREA's existence has kept our focus on cultural variance, cultural forms, cultural relevance for the enterprise of assessment, for sharpening our evaluative judgments. Sometimes we digress from that broader subject to celebrate our specific cultural heritages, but aren't we fortunate that Stafford and our leadership have called our attention back to cultural relevance, cultural variation, and the significance of those variations for making evaluative judgments for the conduct of assessment. But let me quit. I'm really not your speaker today. Rather, our speaker is my friend, Suad Nasir, who will be introduced by my friend, the Dean and Professor of Education, James Anderson.
Hello, my name is James Anderson, and I'm Dean of the College of Education at the Urbana campus of the University of Illinois. It's my honor and my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker to the Edmund Gordon Distinguished Lecture and Plenary Session. If you've been keeping up with announcements in the field of education research, then you already know that Dr. Suad Nasir is one of our nation's most accomplished scholars and leaders. Over the past several years, her scholarship on race, culture, and learning has been recognized by the highest awards in the field of education research. In 2016, Dr. Nasir was elected a fellow in the American Education Research Association. In 2017, she became the 6th president and CEO of the Spencer Foundation, and her leadership has spearheaded the foundation's impact on a range of critical areas in education research. In 2017, she was also elected to membership in the National Academy of Education, and in 2020, she was voted president-elect of the American Education Research Association. Her presidency began at the conclusion of the 2021 AERA annual meeting. We're all hoping and looking forward to her presiding over an in-person AERA annual meeting in San Diego in April of 2022. Dr. Nasir was a faculty member at the University of California, Berkeley from 2008 to 2017 and was selected as the second UC Berkeley Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion in 2015. She also held the Bergenow Chair in Educational Disparities in the Graduate School of Education and was previously the H. Michael and Jean Williams Chair of African American Studies at Berkeley. Dr. Nasir joined the Berkeley faculty in 2008 from the School of Education at Stanford University, where she earned the St. Clair Drake Teaching Award in 2007. Nasir's research focused on issues of race, culture, and learning. Specifically, she theorizes the nature of thinking and learning in relation to processes of identity and explore cultural sustaining teaching approaches. Her numerous articles have appeared in the American Educational Research Journal, Teacher Scholars Record, Educational Researcher, and the Phi Delta Kappan, among other prominent peer-reviewed journals. Her books include Racialized Identities, Race and Achievement Among African American Youth, published in 2011, Mathematics for Equity, a Framework for Successful Practices, published in 2014, and We Dare Say Love, Supporting Achievement in the Educational Life of Black Boys, published in 2018. She recently co-edited the Handbook of the Cultural Foundations of Learning. We're extremely pleased and grateful that Nala Suad Nasir accepted our invitation to give the keynote for the Edmund Gordon Senior Distinguished Lecture and Plenary Session. She will speak to us on the cultural nature of learning, implications for assessment, a topic thoroughly consistent with the mission of CREA. Her presentation will begin following a short video on the Edmund Gordon Annual Lecture.
Okay, great, wonderful. Great to be here. Let's see, so much to say. I mean, I'm so honored by both the introduction and Professor Gordon's introductory comments. I can't even, I'm feeling a little choked up here. I don't know if I'm really deserving of all those accolades. I feel like I've been more lucky than anything, but grateful and blessed to be here to share a few thoughts. I'm particularly honored to be presenting a lecture named after one of the great scholars of our time, Edmund Gordon, who I've admired from afar for most of my career, and who I recently have had the privilege of being in conversation and collaboration with. So Professor Dean Anderson mentioned that I'm serving as president of AERA this year. Professor Gordon is the honorary president, which has been such an honor to be able to plan and think with him. And it's noteworthy to say that he's honorary president because during his time in our field and as a member of AERA, he wouldn't have been able to be president as a Black scholar. At least some things have changed, but other things have not changed. It's noteworthy that Professor Gordon's insight on the need for assessment to be a tool for learning rather than a static supposed measure of knowledge accumulation is as relevant today as it was 30 years ago. But now the learning sciences have caught up with Professor Gordon's wisdom. So my talk today is going to focus on those advances in the learning sciences and on our theories of learning to reflect on what we know about the cultural nature of learning and what implications that might have for how we should be thinking about assessment. Now, let me not overpromise because I'm not an assessment person like you all. So really, I'm going to raise a set of questions so that you all as the experts can decide if they're useful questions to consider and how they might be applied. Okay, now let me see if I can figure out this screen sharing to bring you into my slides. I had a long consultation call with Stafford this morning, so let me see if I can make this work. Here we go, share. Okay, can you all see the slides? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Okay, great. So that was the intro slide. Okay, so first some context. We can't really dive into a discussion of culture and learning without acknowledging the very unique moment we are in as a nation and as a field. We find ourselves in this moment where we are in the midst of multiple pandemics, right? A health crisis, systemic racism, an economic crisis, climate crisis. And we are collectively having this deep realization of the severity and consequences of racial inequality in our society. And I would say that social and educational inequality is the key issue of our time. And I think we've learned that past solutions will not serve us to have the future that we need. So not only is the importance of attending to social and racial inequality on full display in the current moment, and not only are we having conversations that we've never had before, but it is increasingly clear that we're missing something in the way that we frame equity issues. Our framing about equity and racial inequality is undergirded by two problematic things. One, zero-sum game thinking, where we assume that the prosperity and thriving are a finite good. And if we give more of it to those who have been historically exploited and oppressed, then those who have been historically privileged will have less of it. Problematic thought number one. The second problematic undergirding thought is deficit notions of people from marginalized communities, where we view families, communities, and individuals through a lens of lack. You see this in research, you see this in policy. And I think we're coming to realize as a society that equity work isn't about saving Black, Brown, Indigenous, or poor folks. It's actually about building a society that saves us all, and about building a multicultural democracy where all of us can thrive. Heather McGee recently wrote this beautiful book called The Sum of Us, in which she looks over time at major public issues: access to good jobs and pensions, purchasing a home, clean air, access to high quality schools. And for each issue, she notes how racism at key moments in history prevented an opening of access right at the point when it would have served Black folks or folks from other marginalized groups. And in thus closing down the access for Black people, it's the history of this country, access was also shut down for poor whites or women or others who might benefit, thus creating structures that worked against the goal of having a prosperous society. She uses the story of community swimming pools as an important illustration, where she notes, there's a longer description of this in the book, but she talks about the fact that there was a time in this country in the 1940s, 30s, and 40s, where there was an idea of building an elaborate leisure society. And in this time, these really gorgeous public pools were built. In my community in Richmond, California, there's a pool called the Richmond Plunge, and it's just gorgeously ornate. And she makes the observation that that was wonderful for white folks until desegregation. And then when Black people started showing up at these pools, folks panicked, white communities panicked. And instead of keeping this public good for the public, they elected to fill the pools with dirt and eliminate them entirely, right? And so her point is that equitable structures serve us all. And one of the greatest lies is that supporting one group comes at the cost of the well-being of other groups, and that we have historically made decisions to create exclusion that actually are detrimental to all of us. So she writes, the task ahead then is to unwind this idea of a fixed quantity of prosperity and replace it with what I've come to call solidarity dividends, gains available to everyone when they unite across racial lines in the form of higher wages, cleaner air, better funded schools. This is a profound argument for multiplicity, for creating systems that provide ways for many folks to succeed and thrive. Just want to make a couple more points about equitable systems writ broad before I move into the conversation about learning. And this is also a major point in McGee's book. The first is that historically accumulated advantage or disadvantage was created. And I used to say, like, this is the good news and the bad news, folks. The good news and the bad news is that we created this historical accumulation of disadvantage with carefully designed public systems like redlining, right? The good news of that is that if we created it, we could create something different. The bad news is that we created this mess. The second point I want to make is that then we create these systems that create inequalities, that create different classes of folks, and then we utilize ideologies of race to uphold these systems of exclusion, because the ideologies that say Blacks are lazy or not smart make the racial disparities make sense. So as we're dismantling, that requires dismantling both these kinds of public policies, but also dismantling the ideologies that they hang on. And it's clear that this kind of thinking has led us as a society to the state that we are in now, and it's time for a new frame. The only way we get to equity, in my opinion, is to take an asset-based approach, one that centers our collective humanity. Heather McGee starts her book with the question, why can't we have nice things? Which cracked me up, because I have a colleague at Berkeley who was dean of the law school, Melissa, that I'm breaking on her last name, who used to always say that at Berkeley, why can't we have nice things? But when Heather McGee says that, what she means is, why can't we as a nation have systems that work to support the health and well-being of all citizens? And what's so interesting about the question is that it makes clear that when we dehumanize some, by not allowing people to make a decent living, have a roof over their head, food to eat, the ability to buy a house and retire, when we dehumanize some by the very structures that limit the possibilities of having a good life, we really dehumanize all of us. And the only way to get to that place, the place of having nice things as a society, is to be committed to honoring our collective and individual humanity, to see and center the common needs, and in education, to want for everyone what we want for our own children. Because when it comes to our own children, Everyone's pretty clear about what a good education and a good school looks like, though we debate these things publicly. It looks like a place where their individuality, their culture is respected and built upon, where they are not assessed by crude measures such as standardized tests, where there is attention to their holistic development in addition to their intellectual growth, where they are not accosted by racist policies and interactions. And so the imperative is to create an equitable system of education isn't just about doing what's right by ensuring those from marginalized groups have adequate educational resources, nor is it just about disrupting centuries-long processes of opportunity hoarding by white folks. It's about creating a sustainable, thriving society, which we can't do if we leave so many disenfranchised. We need all of us, and we need an education system that prepares critical thinkers and innovators, civically engaged young people and adults, so that we can solve the world's most pressing problems and create just and thriving communities. I mentioned to you, I'm not an assessment person, but as I think about the moment we're in nationally and globally, and specifically with respect to education, I must concede that our approach to assessment is key in our ability to create an education system that is truly about dismantling systems of oppression by supporting all learners. Okay, that's the big vision. Now, how do we get there? I argue that first we must refine and redefine how we understand what learning is at its core. And then we need to re-envision assessment for the purposes of learning, real learning, deep learning, engaged learning. The second part is going to be you all's job, but I'm going to dig in now to the first part. Okay. Understanding learning has been a core task of psychology and education for over 100 years. We have theorized the nature of learning, and how we do so has direct implications for the ways we teach, how we arrange classrooms and other learning settings, and how we organize schools and institutions of learning from pre-K to higher education and beyond. There are really three waves of learning theories that have framed our field with different core assumptions. In the 1940s and 50s, behaviorism reigned. Thorndike's classical conditioning conceived of learning as resulting from associations between stimuli and responses. These associations or habits are strengthened or weakened by the nature and frequency of stimulus-response pairings. In Skinner's operant conditioning, humans are shaped to act in particular ways according to schedules of reinforcement and punishment of the consequences of their actions. The 60s and 70s brought cognitivism. Humans were modeled as active minds, kind of like computers, employing processes of constructing, storing, retrieving, and modifying symbolic representations of information. In the 1990s, sociocultural theory rendered learning as transformations of participation and identity, coupling learning how to know and do with learning how to be and who to be. Each of these frameworks has spawned distinctive pedagogical approaches. Consider skills training or project-based learning, with related approaches to the structures of classrooms and the relationships between teachers and students. From a behaviorist perspective, learning is the accumulation of facts and skills, learned through processes of reinforcement, think behavior management charts with those red and green stickers. From the teacher's job then is to provide information and reinforce its retrieval. From a cognitivist perspective, learning is best cultivated by active exploration in the service of real world tasks. Again, think project-based learning. And teaching young people how to learn is critical to them developing the habits of mind to manage their own learning. A sociocultural perspective would further suggest attention to the social context of teaching and learning, sensitivity to questions of belonging, bias, and inclusion, and respect for the range of repertoires of practice that students bring to the classroom, and a focus on social routines and connections that support learning. Each of these framings and approaches contribute partial truths. Human beliefs and behaviors are shaped by patterns of feedback. People do actively make sense of and construct representations of the world, and they do participate as embodied beings in culturally situated activity systems. But what we really need is a theory of learning that integrates these insights and holds at core a holistic perspective of the learning and dare I say, development of young people. So we wrote a book, or more precisely, I'm trying to keep that shadow off my forehead, or more precisely, my colleagues, Carol Lee, Roy P. and Maxine McKinney de Royston edited a 400-page volume called The Handbook of the Cultural Foundations of Learning. I'm super proud of this volume, even though it's kind of dense and nerdy. It's a gorgeous compilation of chapters written by a diverse and amazing group of scholars. And so when we finished it, we realized this is a book for scholars, and we want to help the world think about how to think about learning differently. We want that work to be impactful and to make its way into systems. And so we thought we should write something accessible to a broad audience that summarizes the core ideas in the handbook. Here's what we came up with. So this is a summary of 400 pages in only 4 bullet points, exercise in precision. And I'm going to go through and explain each in greater detail, but we have argued that there are 4 key principles around learning that the contemporary learning sciences suggest. We call it the RISE principles of learning. That learning is, 1, rooted in evolutionary, biological, and neurological systems. The science is increasingly supportive of this view. But there's a twist there around culture too. 2, that learning is integrated with other developmental processes and integrated in deep fundamental ways: emotion, identity, cognition, make each other up in learning settings. And you can't really have one without the other. 3, learning is shaped in culturally organized practices across people's lives. It happens as we live our daily lives, not something that only happens in school. And 4, learning is experienced as embodied and coordinated through social interaction. And maybe I'll just say, before I jump into offering more explanation on each one, that our goal here, and this is a Carolee kind of mastermind, right? Our goal here was to say, it is not enough to say there is learning, that's this thing, and then there's culture and racialized experience and identity and emotion that you wrap around it. Actually, the very process of learning, the very construct of learning, is in itself cultural, is in itself emotional, is in itself historically rooted. And in this country, it's historically rooted in racist settler colonial ideologies, right? And so you can't disentangle the things. And why that's important is because the goal is to articulate that if learning is cultural in nature, if culture is not an overlay, if racialized systems aren't an overlay, then we really do have to shift how we're thinking about supporting learning for young people in fundamental ways, and that subscribing them young people to racist systems and asking them to learn there is actually to work against the very mechanisms of learning. So I'll get more into this, but I wanted to just give that as the exercise. The exercise is to shift the very definition, right? So that it opens space for new types of approaches to teaching and to assessment. This is why it's so weird to give a Zoom talk, because I can't feel the audience. So I hope that this is useful. Okay, so the first principle. Learning is, where am I on this? Learning is a pervasive and fundamentally human activity that arises out of our biological need to be connected to social others and adapt to the environment. Like, that's a lot, that's a big mouthful. This is the most challenging of the principles to explain. But we've long known that we are hardwired to learn, right? It's just a human activity. Our biological, neurological, and evolutionary systems leave us with the capability to adapt and learn from our environment. It's how we've survived as a species. So that part's not new. But what is new is the idea that even those systems, biological systems, neurological systems, evolutionary systems, are themselves cultural and social in nature. Our brains are hardwired to learn implicitly and observationally from others, and to do so from a place of emotional connection. And culture and biology, despite some historical opinions, are not actually separate from another. They interact in multiple and consequential ways. Thus, rooting our understanding of learning in the evolutionary, biological, and neurological systems through which it takes shape requires us to recognize that cultural processes are central to each of these systems. For example, while evolution has been historically conceptualized as the way biological organisms change over generations by chance and by necessity, more contemporary perspectives view evolution as both the evolution of the biological organism or people, and also the evolution of the institutional and cultural niches in which that organism operates. This is from the work of Martin Packer and Mike Cole. and how these organisms and institutional systems interact. So from this perspective, then, culture is the medium through which humans adapt to varying conditions of life with attending impacts within and across timescales of human biological systems. To be human is to learn, because learning is an inherently adaptive process. So human adaptability is underscored by evidence from the neurosciences, which finds that not only are human brains malleable, but the brain is also quite social, in addition to being wired to learn from implicit and observational stimuli. Learning is also enhanced or impeded by emotion, and this slips a little bit into the second principle. Studies with very young children show that babies respond selectively to situations with emotional valence, skillfully imitating or choosing not to imitate in order to avoid incurring observed anger on the part of adults. Studies with adolescents similarly show the intertwining of emotion, learning, and brain function. The work of Imardino Yang has shown that the brain network that supports socio-emotional aspects of personal memory, future-oriented thinking, and conceptual understanding deactivates during task-oriented focus. What this means is that for learning is that it has to be reflective. So in order to facilitate emotional resilience and investments in learning, you have to leave space for people to reflect and think and not always be in a task-oriented moment. Anyway, the big point here is that neurological, biological, and evolutionary systems that undergird learning are themselves deeply cultural and social. Learning is also integrated with a range of developmental domains, including cognitive, social, emotional, and identity processes. Further development in these domains is constituted by individuals' participation in a range of different and overlapping cultural practices. In other words, learning always occurs in a social and cultural context and involves a full range of human identity and emotion. This attention to context makes visible that membership in marginalized gender, racial, ethnic, disability status, language proficiency, and immigration status groups can mean that one must manage environments that are not set up to meet their developmental needs, and indeed are designed to reinforce marginalization by not meeting developmental needs. This was an epiphany I had when my Black son turned 12, right? My own work has noted the conundrum facing Black boys during adolescence. Precisely when adolescents have a developmental need for competence, autonomy, care, community, and a sense of identity and place in the world, they are too often treated in schools with suspicion as the other and are met with a profound lack of care. So healthy identity development involves both positive embrace of the identities attached to group membership and resistance to processes that negatively influence one's healthy emotional development, such as being stereotyped. So the resistance behaviors that we see in young people are actually developmentally and psychologically healthy. Emotional needs for safety and belonging are also key components of the learning process. When a sense of belonging and emotional safety are present, learners are better able to engage, learn, and to develop identities as learners. The big point here is that the psychosocial is integral to learning, not a nice to have that layers on top. Fundamental shift in how we've thought about how these psychosocial forces impact learning. Third, okay, so this is rather obvious, though we rarely attend to it in schools. Learning happens everywhere. It happens in many settings, including but also beyond schools. This is also a legacy of Ed Gordon's work, by the way. Community spaces can be important sites for learning, and understanding the nature of learning in such spaces affords us a fuller understanding of how learning itself occurs within social and institutional settings and across the lifespan, and the way it's guided by the needs and interests of learners. We saw some of this with the pandemic, right? That young people had the space to follow their interests because the constriction of the time in school was a little bit relaxed. You know, people have studied this in lots of different settings. Shirley Bryce Heath and colleagues have a chapter in the handbook where they look at the learning that occurs in refugee camps in Kenya, in youth prison environments, and in a drama program for houseless youth. They use the term adaptive learning, making the point that learning is what people do in all manner of social contexts and circumstances to better their futures, to engage with social others, and to experience freedom. Mike Rose, my dear colleague that passed about a month ago, has similarly written about learning that occurs in blue collar work, waitressing, hairdressing, welding, highlighting that sophisticated learning is fundamentally a part of human experience and activity. Thus, sophisticated and multidimensional learning occurs everywhere. This requires rethinking learning beyond the highly controlled, constrained designs we find in most classrooms. Teaching should bring on natural interests and capacities rather than simply engaging in the forced march of learning observable in many classrooms. This perspective also acknowledges that learning unfolds on multiple pathways across lives at once, and that learning at its best is a tapestry where what's learned in one setting is expanded and built upon in another setting in ways that honor and enrich the experiences of every learner. And yet, we must remember before we get to kumbaya about all of this, that learning is not neutral. We are more willing to see learning and practices associated with formal learning spaces, less inclined to see the complexity of learning that occurs elsewhere, particularly in lower status or blue collar settings. Learning settings are power-laden, historically located, and weighted with histories of oppression and or freedom. Schools have complicated histories and can at once be institutions that perpetuate and deepen inequalities and do damage to humanity. And they could also be spaces that disrupt inequalities and create opportunities for social justice and change. For me, that was one of the legacies of Jim Anderson's classic text, to kind of point out that contradiction. And it's not simply that schools have provided unequal access to high quality teaching, which they have, or that learning in settings outside of school, or that learning happens in settings outside of school, which it does. We must also understand that what we learn, the curriculum, the core ideas embedded within it, and how we learn is also not neutral. Indeed, the canon across multiple disciplines acts as a process of exclusion, erasure, and onto-epistemic violence. To quote Beth Warren and Megan Bang, for Native, Black, Latinx, and other non-dominant groups, decisions around what to include and exclude in the canon become forms of sanctioned epistemic stances. We're seeing this with the CRT madness across the country right now. So these decisions become forms of sanctioned epistemic stances and are thus instruments of racial, colonial, and patriarchal motives to oppress and to erase. White supremacist ideology is ensconced in curricular as well as pedagogical choices, whereby what are presumed to be white ways of being and doing are normed and centered. Teaching in anti-racist and justice-oriented ways requires a commitment to move beyond colonial terms for learning, embracing multiplicity, and seeing learning as intimately connected to processes of liberation and freedom. And finally, we've established that learning is everyday human activity, that it is cultural and adaptive in nature. I lost my point because I checked the time. That it involves neurological brain and cognitive processes which interact in complex and consequential ways within the social and political context. That really our point here is learning involves all of the aspects of what it means to be human. And so this fourth point pulls in another key aspect of what it means to be human. We experience the world through symbolic systems and through our bodies. Uses of the body and of representational systems are key to how human and learning activity is organized and coordinated. Learning at its core is about engaging in coordinated cultural activity. Language is central in this mediation, but so is nonverbal communication, such as gestures, eye gaze, bodily orientation, geared toward the establishment of joint attention and negotiation of meaning. Ananda Marin has talked about this as learning on the move and has done some really beautiful studies of how these body gestures and orientations become really integral to the learning process. So in addition to language as a direct mediator of learning, language and discourse also function to position learners into identities in learning spaces, thus operating as a tool by which power is instantiated and negotiated. And the acquisition or not of language is another way that power is negotiated, with stigmatization of community language practices, oppressing and denying young people their opportunities to learn. Okay, I know that was a lot. It was a lot of words. I'm going to do some kind of summarizing. So I'm going to offer a few key takeaways. 1, learning is fundamentally cultural in nature, even when we take seriously neurological, biological, and evolutionary factors. 2, effective learning takes place across settings along many simultaneous pathways, I will say at many different paces. 3, we can't separate cognition from emotion, identity, and psychological safety. So our task then is to create systems of teaching and learning that honors this, that honors the what we know. But wait, before I talk about what those learning systems might look like, I want to take one brief detour about a major barrier to creating the kinds of learning systems that align with what we know from the science, and that is deficit thinking. Deficit thinking or deficit approaches are perhaps best understood in contradiction to asset or strength-based approaches. But what we mean by deficit thinking is here on the slide. Deficit thinking blames students for their shortcomings and can lead to educators believing that such shortcomings are incapable of being changed or supported at school. So when you assume young people, families, communities, teachers are deficit at their core and your job is to fix them, you're already in the wrong place, and a place that it's very, very hard to get out of. People have written about this. This is from a paper by Greens and Haynes in 2011 that compares deficit-based approaches to asset-based approaches, where deficit-based approaches are needs-driven. They're based on what you think people need. They're problems-focused. They're about fixing problems that seem to be presenting themselves. They're externally focused about not how the community itself solves the problems, but how other outsiders provide interventions or solutions to solve problems. And the goal is to figure out what's missing that we must go find or provide. Asset-based frames are quite different. They're strengths-driven. So they start with what's happening that's good. They're opportunity focused and ask what we can build upon here. What's the opportunity here? And they're internally focused. How does a community or young person or family have the resources to solve their own problems or challenges? And the question that one asks is, what is present that we can build upon? And I've been kind of fascinated with thinking about deficit and asset-based frames in education and educational research. I'm not gonna go too far down this rabbit hole, but we at Spencer issued a call right in the midst of COVID for scholars to send proposals in about COVID, and specifically about some of the systemic and racial inequalities that I won't say emerged during COVID, but were more fully on display during COVID in education. And we asked people to think specifically in asset-based ways. And what we got was a whole range of things. And surprisingly, a lot of what we got was actually rooted in these kind of deficit ideologies. And so I started thinking, like, how do we talk about this to scholars? How do we talk about this to funders of research to say, it was like one of those epiphany moments for me, like, oh, so much of what we do as scholars is rooted in these core ideologies about communities, families, and young people that are racist, that are sometimes gendered, that are rooted in settler colonial ways of making sense of things. And so sometimes at the core of our research endeavor, we take up these deficit frames without even knowing it. So I went on this whole long thing about how do we describe what this is in research, and how do we talk about what it would look like to do strength-based work. So we essentially coded 1,500 proposals that we'd gotten in the door for this call, which, by the way, I read all of those proposals myself. Never do that again. But it was striking how even well-intentioned scholars took up deficit frames in their work. And I think that's true of teachers and education systems as well. People with the very best intentions still see certain young people and families as irrevocably damaged. And so our task in this coding exercise was to figure out, how do we explain and describe what these two approaches are? And what we found in doing that work was that there were actually 3 approaches. So the first is deficit-based, and that's really about maintaining the status quo in systems. And the core question in that work is, how do we help or change individuals, families, or communities so that they can participate in and benefit from current systems? The burden there is on people within inequitable and problematic systems to change themselves to fit into systems better. And then there was another category that we didn't have the language for before we did this coding exercise, and we came to call that equity-based. And that was about reforming systems. Like, how do we take current systems, At some point, we had called this tweaking systems, as it felt a little derogatory, but you kind of get the point, right? Like this work was about not fundamentally changing the systems we have, but making them less terrible and a little more equitable, tinkering around the edges. And the question here is, how do we broaden access to current systems and reform them to be more equal? A surprising bulk of the work we got in fit into that category. And then there was the third category that we called strength-based, that was really about reimagining systems. And the question there is, how do we reimagine systems to amplify and value and build upon the strengths of people, the strengths people already have, right? I've been struck by this, this quote from my colleague in philanthropy that I'm blanking on her name, Gabrielle. Oh, it'll come to me. But we were in a meeting, we were talking about learning and thriving and how the lack of access to learning and thriving in marginalized communities. And she said, well, you know, it strikes me that if you want to know about thriving, you should look at how these oppressed communities have survived and thrived in the face of hundreds of years of oppression. Like it flipped the whole thing on its head, right? There are tools and strengths that we never even think to look for and think about. Anyway, the point of all of this is to say that what's key is that if we're going to study and create systems from a strength-based or asset-based lens, then this notion of reimagining or creating anew with people, with young people, with families, with communities is really at the center. And by the way, it's not enough to just tinker with our existing systems or to mediate the effects of fundamentally flawed systems in minor ways. And I feel like we do that a lot. We do that a lot in a lot of ways. We do that a lot also with assessment, where we're layering it onto a system that's fundamentally flawed. And I would say that we as scholars, if anyone has an obligation to do better, we have an obligation to do better, because our whole job is to sit back and think and write and study and ponder and imagine. And if we can't reimagine an education system, an assessment system, I'm just not sure who we're expecting to have the time and energy to do that work. So to summarize, deficit perspectives refer to viewpoints assuming students from marginalized groups are operating from a place of damage and there's something wrong with them, their families or their communities that have left them ill-equipped to learn. Such perspectives are rampant in education and have been used historically and contemporarily to justify under-resourcing schools and classrooms serving students from marginalized groups, then blaming that underachievement on the students, on the families, and on the communities. However, we could alternatively assume that the job of teaching is to reveal the innate strengths, the innate brilliance in every student, their remarkable capacity to learn, the kind of learning we see without any effort in settings outside of school. And if we made those assumptions, we'd create the systems and structures that allow students to really blossom intellectually. Okay, I'm gonna winding down, just have a couple more slides. And so what kind of schools and classrooms would we build if we took the learning science seriously? We would build schools and classrooms where pedagogy centers on love. And love is a strong word to use in education spaces, but what I mean by that is that when you love the children that are standing in front of you, you give them every opportunity, right? You assume the best intention. You recognize when systems are harming them. You provide the types of resources every human needs, right? The schools and classrooms we need would provide emotional safety. They would provide relational resources for learners and opportunities to connect identity with learning, which again is fundamental human need. They would hold high standards for learners, but also provide multiple pathways, multiple problem-solving pathways, multiple ways of thinking that get to that high standard. They would disrupt racial inequality and be humanizing spaces rather than dehumanizing spaces. And they would align across multiple aspects of the system, schools, districts, classrooms, out of school. Okay, and then almost finally, what does all this mean for a culturally rooted and developmentally grounded theory of assessment? How might the scholarship on learning that's been reviewed here have implications for what we should assess and how we should assess it? I would argue that there are three key takeaways for how we might think about assessment in light of what we know about the cultural nature of learning, or rather, three key questions we might ask. The first is that if learning is contextually and culturally rooted, then how do we ensure that assessments reflect that too? Knowledge is not extractable or objective. And given this, we can't assume that assessments will be able to measure knowledge without context or measure the mastery of concepts without considering how those concepts are being situated relative to the kinds of settings and cultural practices young people engage in as a part of their daily lives, in school and out. It likely means that for assessment to be most valid, it should occur in situ to assess how young people use and produce knowledge in real settings. Second, if multiple learning pathways and variation is a rule and not an exception, then how do we assess learning in a way that doesn't assume one linear pathway for learning? If we know that multiple learning and pathways, this could mean that assessment would allow multiple ways of thinking, multiple solution paths, and would weigh the quality of the thinking rather than simply evaluating whether the answers are right or wrong on multiple choice test items. It also means we might expect more and greater variation and actually laud that variation rather than assuming that all students are on a similar linear path across all disciplines at the same pace. It might also mean that we allow and foster more variation in relation to interests and experience, which young people across cultural communities are calling for and finding schools lacking. Third, how do we ensure assessment environments meet the needs for relationship, connections, emotional safety, and attention to well-being? We must account for the fact that the conditions of learning require these things, right? How do we ensure that the assessment environment meets those needs as well as the instructional environment? All these observations taken together seem to indicate that assessment might be best designed to be formative in nature, embedded in normal classroom activity, deeply connected to the kinds of teaching and learning practices and content learning in which young people are engaged. This is not an easy design task, but in this moment where we're seeing fatigue and disenchantment with high stakes standardized measures of learning and a deep longing for systems of education that support deeper learning and unequivocal equity, thus it seems like a right time for reimagining our teaching, learning, and assessment systems, and doing so with the developmental and human needs of young people at the center. And to conclude, I repeat myself on purpose because I feel like as humans, we use, well, as scholars, we use a lot of words. As humans, we can only really hold 3 points at once. So concluding thoughts. New systems of teaching and learning are necessary to disrupt social inequality and racism. It's time for us to think in fundamentally different ways about building systems with solidarity dividends at their core that serve everyone. And that serve everyone by an opening, not a narrowing. And we need a vision for equitable, sustainable, and a deeply humanizing education system. And at the heart of this system is an expanded notion of learning and an alternative perspective on the goal and the practices of assessment. So I'm going to end there, and I'd love to invite Professor Gordon, if you have any reactions, reflections, or comments to get us started into the Q&A.
Wow, that's powerful, lady. Thank you very much. I must say, I'm sitting here with conflicting thoughts. One of the things I discussed with my kids around my 100th birthday was the notion that maybe in my next 100 years, I should listen more. You learn more listening than you do talking. If I were to follow that advice, I'd pass at this moment and say, no, thank you. I've got nothing to say. Let's hear some questions. But there was an issue that I came to this session worrying about, and you alerted me that you didn't know anything about it. So I'll mention it and comment on it briefly, and invite our colleagues, if they have digested some of what you've had to say, to join us on a bit of conversation. I ask if we know of places in the world where the kinds of things you're talking about for education are underway, and Stafford, the kinds of things we are advocating in CREA, the creation of situations that are truly respectful of diverse cultural forms. And just before we started talking, Naila reminded us that maybe Singapore might be a place, and maybe Finland. She mapped onto my list. I would have begun with the Scandinavian countries, but I wouldn't ignore this country, the state of California and the state of New York, both of which are a long way from where we need to be, but they seem to be trying harder than some states. Now, what is it about those geographic areas of the world that lead them to be out front? And two things have occurred to me that are almost contradictory. The Scandinavian countries tend to be traditionally homogeneous populations. And where in the world do we have a more diverse population than in the state of California or the state of New York? So at both of these extremes. What then is peculiar to it? If we take California and New York, these diverse societies find it necessary to worry about their their humanness and what they need to do to enhance it. And in the homogeneous societies, they seem to be they seem to be more ready to look for common need. But the common element in both of these extremes is a point that Professor Dr. Nasir began her comments with, and that is the placing of humanity at the core of what we're about, the enablement, the enhancement of the celebration of humanity. So if I were to take anything I want to underscore from that oversupply of ideas, I will offer that one and invite our colleagues to join the discussion and let us know what they think about an excellent presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you, Prof. Gordon, it's such a pleasure to see you. Thank you, Dr. Nasir, for your amazing talk. I want to just start out by just giving more vote of thanks to you, Prof, for being here. And I'd start with, that first comment that you made, actually, Dr. Nasir, as I open up the floor, and I've been organizing a few questions in the chat, and I'll lead to them, but let me just halt you right now with that. I don't know if I'm deserving point you made in the beginning. And I'll just say, for those of us in the academic battlefields and cornfields, we know you're more than deserving. Thank you for your leadership at the helm of the largest educational research association in the world. Thank you for your presidency of one of the most prestigious foundations of educational research in the United States and in the world. That in and of itself is amazing. That in and of itself is prescient. That in of itself is absolutely profound. And so thank you for your words here. Now, some of us also have the benefit of reading your work. I happen to be referring to a chapter that's forthcoming in a series that Hood et al. Have put together in Rich Milner's Harvard Ed Press series, where you actually discuss some of the same. And in that paper, you started off with some of the same presses, but also recognizing and acknowledging the current pandemic moment. You spoke about the history of research on the cultural nature of learning and the current state of art and knowledge in the field of how we understand learning. And so thank you so much for going into that, both for in the history of the research on the cultural nature of learning, of reminding us that the strategies and structures of schooling vis-a-vis and beside the learning transmission of knowledge are linked. And also for reminding us that the traditions in the science of learning also, beside the Black psychological traditions, also yield themselves new learnings. And thank you again for bringing the current state of art, the art of what we know around learning from your mentor, Carol Lee, and the principle-oriented nature of the current state, which sounds like a bit of a diversion, but also in terms of recognizing the theoretical, practical, and competing tensions in the field, which we live in today, and you had explained some. But I would say, and I'll just say it as we open up the questions, and I have a few for you, this epiphanic moment that you had, I think there's some questions, there's already some questions about sharing how you went about coding those categorizations. And so there's already a question, I noticed that, the deficit, the equity, the strength space. Thank you so much for reminding us that sometimes even in our own thinking, we often illustrate some of this deficit thinking, and then we can push it further. I would like to just bring up one notion that Prof. Gordon wrote about around the notion of liberation of science. He wrote, liberation is a value of science. That should be the perspective from which minority scientists seek to advance multiple perspectives and methodological rigor, not for the purpose of simply predicting, controlling, and understanding, but for the purpose of emancipating, liberating the bodies, minds, communities, and spirits of oppressed humankind. It's this where I actually want to just move the conversation, because I think this also speaks to some other questions, because that epiphany about recognizing the already brilliant, by recognizing the already liberatory, I would argue is not only in, like Prof says, is only in Finland, it's not only in Scandinavia, but it's also in the United States as well. I think the question here is that one of the questions I think are generally around the role of reimagining, because I think most of the comments start to think about what is this reimagining space, and how do schools themselves and systems themselves in the context of this multiple and this multicultural democracy, how do we begin to reimagine these? I'm going to throw that general one out there right for you, generally about the reimagining, and then go to the depth of some of these questions as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Thank you for those comments. And I can talk about the coding scheme too. But I'll start with your question about reimagining. I think there is a tension here, right? And I noticed one of the comments in the chat was like, yeah, that was all hopeful and nice. And there's trauma that comes from these historically and contemporarily oppressive systems. And how do we not be too overly optimistic in the face of one major challenges, deep investment in white supremacy. I mean, it's a time with a glimmer of hope and a lot of headwind as well. But it's also a time I've never seen in my lifetime. And so I don't want to miss the moment either. And I don't want to, and this is a Carol Lee lesson in my life, to say, don't cede the power. Like, this community of scholars has the power to redefine some things, to say, this is not acceptable, this is where we're moving, this is where we must be going. And it's partly how I think about the work of a foundation like Spencer or an organization like AERA. Part of the point is to set the tone and invite people into a new kind of conversation. And I worry that we spend a lot of time critiquing and understanding the nature of these oppressive systems and the impacts, and not enough time figuring out what we would do differently if we could. Because we can't do anything differently until we have a vision of what that would look like. And that's not to say we don't acknowledge the deep and profound and utter impacts of generations of oppressive systems. We all live them. I could tell you about my daddy, right? We don't have time in this session, but we're all living that for sure, and picking up and cleaning up the pieces, both within ourselves and within our families, within our communities. At the same time, here we are as scholars, here we are as people with relative privilege and relative power, and we can't cede that power to those who might not share our goals for liberation. We actually have to take the reins and lead the field And I mean, like CREA should be leading assessment orgs around these questions. ETS should be coming to you all to say, what do we do? How do we think about this? And taking up that space of, taking up that leadership space in the field is, I just think it's really important for us to do at this moment where there is this kind of tiny window. And I don't think this is work of one generation. Like, I think this is work of multiple generations. But we, I think about my children who are young adults, and my youngest is 16, and he looks at me like, your generation really messed up around climate change. Like, what were y'all thinking? It's like, Mom, do you know that in 40 years, the planet's going to be, and I'm like, so what's the responsibility we hold to turn the tide around the issues that are most pressing? And that's where the reimagining comes into me. It's the privilege and the responsibility to not just say what we don't want, but to say what we do want and what we need, and then to start to push systems to get there.
Fabulous. I think you've answered some questions, but I'll just give a few stems. And if you did address them, we'll keep moving them. One of the questions has to do with the shift of thinking of those in power, those who are given the power to define how we collectively are seen in the learning landscape. There's a question about how scholars or evaluators or research who are not yet liberated, how we can become liberated, or how we address the questions about systems of change and celebrating resiliency, but also be used as an excuse by the system that change is not needed, as some of us haven't been oppressed. And so that's a question that maybe look familiar. Do any of these sound like something you want to dive into?
Yeah, all of them. Great questions. Well, let me start with that last one about how we manage that tension between celebrating resilience and messaging that there's not a need for change. It's one of the things that I found beautiful in post 2020, and this may be because I'm a foundation president and I report to a board, and post June 2020, there was such energy and a tone shift in my board, in other foundation boards, in communities writ large, in the business community. And so there was this recognition in a mass way of the things that, folks in our community have been saying forever, like, this is wrong. Like, this is not the way we need to be running systems. We are all on a road to nowhere together. And it was as if post June 2020, there was a massive recognition that this isn't just about helping those who have been disenfranchised. This is about whether we have a sustainable social system. And you cannot have a sustainable social system if a good swath of your folks get underdeveloped, oppressed, and exploited. You just can't. I was at this meeting maybe 4 or 5 years ago now at Columbia, that was about equity, and they brought in scholars, an education person, a health person, a financial markets person, and we did these little spiels about how equity is, how the lack of equity is really a problem. And it was like a very broad group of thinkers, and a good contingency of the folks there were like former Obama national security advisor, staffer type people, including the former head of the CIA. And I was like, I have no idea why these people are in the room. Like, if you care about national security, I don't get why a conference about equity is a place you want to show up. And then they started talking, and it dawned on me that they were there because the inequality and the levels of inequality in our society are a threat to national security. So this, again, isn't about helping people. This is about a functional system. You can't have a functional system that disenfranchises so many people. And that's a part of this mass movement. And it gets to a little bit of the question about shifting the thinking of those in power. Even if those in power are most self-interested, even then, this moment of the need for change is undeniable. And people will, the ignorant and the entrenched will dig in and argue that the current systems are fine because they're serving the interest of white power and privilege. But even those, I think, making that argument recognize that it's not sustainable. You could do this for another 20 years. And if you do this for another 20 years, we are no longer a competitive global power as a nation. So the imperative is both about what's right and about what's sustainable. And we don't like to make those arguments. So Megan Bang and I argue about this all the time, where she'd be like, I don't like the arguments that this is about, national competitiveness. People are not cogs in capitalist wheels, right? And yes, absolutely. And there's this really odd interest convergence happening that we have to be prepared to lean into with expanded theoretical frameworks. And I'll say, like, to my younger scholar colleagues, like, I'm so in awe of this younger generation, because folks just say the real, like, they're not. I think our generation had there was a need to utilize the language and frameworks of the time. And so when I look back at my own early work, I'm like, oh, yikes, that's not good. That's a little deficit oriented myself. It wasn't my intention, but those were the frames we had. And so I look to this younger generation of scholars who are creating new frames, who are resisting those conformist deficit-oriented frames, who are saying, absolutely not, like, we're going to center our own positionality in the systems. We're going to center our critiques of the systems in ways that are unapologetic. I think we need all of that. And I have so much faith and hope in the generations coming, in this generation and the one behind them and the one behind them, and those folks in graduate school now and those folks in undergrad now that are really insisting on the kind of system change that we want to see.
We're coming to an end. We have a few more minutes, but I can put a few more questions, Dr. Nasir, if you'd like, and then also Prof, if we can continue to create space for him and see if he has any thoughts. And I'll take a point from your last point, which I'm seeing in my work as well. And I think you tapped it in talking about the principles related to RISE, and especially the embodied and expressed notion of learning. Like, we've realized that we can't have the academic, we can't speak academic to the people in the hood. Like, if we don't speak emotional to the people in multiple places, whether it be the barrios, the hoods, the cornfields, multiple places, we can't speak emotional and not only speak academic, then we lose our audiences. Like, and I don't know if we do that really well, but I thought about that expressed and embodied as a way in which we can't talk only measures, but have to also talk mental and talk about things that are emotional. The questions that people are raising have to do with, I think we'll stay in the reimagined space, because that's probably where the space where we should be. Reimagining the digital learning in this particular time, reimagining the support for our essential workers, that is our teachers in education, reimagining different kinds of debates and reconciliations in a partisan, political, and normative climate. How to write a proposal, using these to write a proposal to address hidden biases in STEM for students of color. Like, there's some really particular and practical things, large, small, practical, praxis-oriented, and theoretical, that maybe we can leave you with and Prof with as we end.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll cede the floor to Professor Gordon if there's anything you want to say as we close out.
I almost interrupted you when you were backing away, it appeared, from what sounded like an international concern that you were going into, and you saw it as competitive. And I wanted to interrupt you to say, but it's got to be there, because if COVID taught us anything, we are humans on a little planet that's threatened. And if it happens in India or the depth of Africa, it impacts New York.
Yeah.
So the tension of competition, but there's also the tension of needed cooperation, collaboration.
Yeah. And that and to your point, the kinds of, when you ask the question, Professor Gordon, about where are there places where we see this actually happening, one of the first things I thought about was how global anti-Blackness is, and how you see it in every country across the globe. Right. And how in the protests following George Floyd's murder, you saw protests not just in every city in this country, but in
the major cities of the world.
Yes, yes. So this is, and I guess to your point, then maybe it's a flip on that, on the way we're thinking about what competition means. Maybe actually what it means is that we have to all across the globe take up these issues and figure out a new way, because otherwise we're all kind of doomed. And you're right. One of the lessons of the pandemic is that global, that we are all tied together, that the humanity of each of us is tied to the humanity of all of us. It's one of the things I was thinking, Rodney, when you talked about how do we communicate with our communities? Because I would argue that that emotional embodiedness that is human is how we communicate with all communities. And the question is, why have we accepted the narrow definition of a European tradition that causes us to leave those things on the table? But if you notice, it's not like suburban white kids are loving school either, right? Like, we aren't creating systems that work very well for anyone. And so this need to reimagine is about equity, but it's also about, having a system that allows us to prepare the young people to solve the problems of the future, and about how we prepare young people to embrace this global community at a different level.
In my classes, we end early. I think it's appropriate that we end a little early, give each other an opportunity to go and freshen up for the next session. Again, Prof. Gordon, this lecture has continued to be one of the hallmarks of CREA, not only for the legacy you continue to have for many of us Gordon scholars, but also for those who speak on your behalf, like Dr. Nasir. Thank you all for a great conference. Thank you again, Dr. Nasir, for your poignant and prescient words, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, Rodney. Thank you, Nair. Naila.
Thank you.